Good afternoon. I'm so sorry. I'm not a technical person and we have clearly some issues. So welcome to this seminar titled Connected Health, Is This Our Future? Not Disconnected IT. So my name is Anne Green and I'm chair of the New South Wales division of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, otherwise known as ATSE. And I'm delighted to welcome you all finally to this function organised jointly with ATSE and with the Union University and Schools Club. And we have people online, so welcome to you too. In the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and in particular the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we are meeting here. And of course, there are people on other lands online. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us today. And we acknowledge their most ancient and enduring knowledge embedded forever in the custodianship of country. So we're joined today by fellows of ATSE, members of the Union Club, as well as friends, collaborators here in person and online across Australia. So welcome to everybody. ATSE is a learned academy of independent experts, and our fellows are among Australia's leaders in applied science, technology and engineering. They provide impartial, practical and evidence-based advice on how to achieve sustainable solutions and advance prosperity for our society. And today's event has three eminent experts who are going to advance those goals. So just some little logistics. Bathrooms are on this floor, and in the very unlikely event of an emergency, please use the stairs and not the lift. Technical organisation, thank goodness, is by the Secretariat of ATSE and the Union Club, and I thank them for their assistance. We have several participants online, up to 30, and all the online people will have their videos and audio muted for the presentations, but there will be ample time afterwards for Q&A, and also I hope you in the room will ask questions. So the presentation will be recorded and it should be available shortly on the ATSE website. So today, we are fortunate to have three eminent experts who are the outstanding thought leaders on this vital topic of e-health. And they're going to discuss online and wearable technologies which will impact how we manage health and wellness post-COVID and into the future. They will address key issues and opportunities for the continuity of healthcare from the hospital to the community to the home, saving lives while also saving money. In this day and age, that's good. So now I would like to introduce the three speakers, and Nigel has just said I'm not allowed to speak very long. So first, a person who will be bookending and speaking first is Professor Nigel Lovell, who's director of the Tyree Institute for Health Engineering, and he is also currently in the Graduate School of Biomedical Engineering, where he holds the position of Scientia Professor and is also head of school. So his research has covered huge areas ranging from cardiac and genetic modelling, medical informatics, data analytics, and lots of other things. All right, Nigel. Stopping. However, I'd like to say that as well as being fellow at ATSE, he is fellow of 7 learned academies throughout the world. And in 2017, 2018, he was president of the world's largest biomedical engineering society, which is the IEEE Engineering and Medicine Biology Society. So Nigel. And then speaking after Nigel will be Laura, who's currently a professor in the Graduate School of Biomedical Engineering, New South Wales, and is Deputy Director of the Tyree Foundation Institute of Health Engineering. I'm not sure I said it, but Nigel is the director. So Laura leads a research group focused on the design and development of novel neural interfacing materials, and she's held several senior leadership roles at UNSW, most recently as Pro Vice Chancellor and Dean of Graduate Research. She's held lots of appointments as preclinical scientist and working on the development of implantable devices and cancer treatments. And she's done a huge amount with regulatory requirements for federal committees. In particular, I'd like to say, so as well as being a fellow at ATSE, Laura was awarded honours in 2020 as a member of the Order of Australia for service to biomedical engineering education, and she's an elected fellow of 3 prestigious academies. And then the third speaker is Zia, who is a researcher with extensive clinical expertise in the fields of coronary intervention and cardiac device implementation, including remote technical monitoring technologies. So he is Senior Staff Specialist at Prince of Wales Hospital and currently Director of the Coronary Care Unit. So he's also connected with UNSW and was recently appointed Clinical Lead for the Connected Health Research Program. So one of the key things, and I'm sure you will speak about it, he's co-designed and validated a smartphone app model called Tele-Clinical Care, which has been implemented to facilitate large-scale monitoring of COVID patients and cardiovascular patients in the community. And this really lies at the core of South East Sydney Local Health District strategy to establish remote monitoring for patients with chronic disease in post-COVID era. So now I would really welcome Nigel.
Absolute honour to be here and happy to have the opportunity to make some personal connections along with the virtual connections. I know that these hybrid connections are a little difficult, as Anne can attest to, but you'll hear this word connection or connectivity or connectedness a lot through this talk. I hope you don't get sick of it, but it's absolutely sort of crucial to the theme of this talk. If I can get this thing to advance, I'm pushing the down arrow.
No, okay. There.
Right.
Yes.
So look, I'd assume that the ATSE audience would be very comfortable with the concept of technology and how it impacts literally all our lives, indeed our very existence. And when it comes to technology and health, I think we've seen that the technology is a critical enabler of medical discoveries, of therapeutics, and of diagnostics. And the history of medicine chronicles this sort of connectedness between technology and biology. And if you look there, you'll see the first electrocardiogram that was recorded about 100 years ago by Einthoven. And the physics of that recording hasn't changed today. There's still the concept of a connection between some technology and the person. In this case, we've got a transducer that senses ionic currents in the body, and Einthoven had his hands in some buckets of saline, and that was converted into electric current, and you've got this string galvanometer that then displays the signal. And today we have exactly the same physics. We need to have the same connectivity, but it's done in a much more sophisticated manner. So if you look through history as well, there are many other examples of this. So similarly for medical imaging, so Lauterbur in the 1970s won a Nobel Prize for this work. And this is his first image of the abdomen recorded using an MRI machine. And it took about half a day to visualize that image. But I think you'll agree that the principles behind these are all related to sort of the applying engineering tools and techniques and approaches to solve problems to benefit humanity. And these benefits are manifest in many ways, and connectedness is absolutely core to that, whether it's connecting sort of physiological measurement devices to patients for improving patient and population health outcomes, reducing healthcare expenditure, or more equitable access to healthcare services. So an inescapable fact in all that is that there needs to be an interface or connection between the biology and technology, and really that's the core of today's talk. But I wanted to frame it in terms of what we've been doing over the last year, and that was related to the creation of an Institute of Health Engineering, so the Tyree Foundation Institute of Health Engineering. So it's been going for about a year now, and we've formed a core team with core capabilities. We've got a software health foundry with half a dozen software developers. We've got core expertise in computational modelling, biosignal processing, and predictive analytics. And we've instantiated one research translation pillar around connected health. And really that is the topic of today's talk. The vision of Cardiovascular Eye Healthy is to translate medical technologies to meet unmet patient and clinician needs. The differentiator is this focus on translation, and the way we're going to do that is through co-design and connections and interfaces. And I think Laura's going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. As well as Sian, who's going to talk about connected health from a clinician's perspective. So literally, I'm going to bookend the talk, literally the thorn between the two roses of Laura and Sian. We have Bina as well, who's the Connected Health academic lead in Tyree Eye Healthy, so she's here in the audience. So on that note, I might just hand over to Laura.
That was just an aside, it's the down arrow button. Okay, so I'm going down arrow. It's so lovely to be here and to see you all in 3 dimensions. I think this has been put off now 3 times last year, I think it was. So it's sort of delayed gratification, but I think we're now all here, and it's wonderful to see you all, and welcome to those of you who are online as well. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a run through of some of the background of connected health, and really I think in the interest of time, very simply put, connected health is enabling patient-provider connectivity anytime, anywhere. It's interesting because I'll come back to that definition a little bit later, but the sorts of things that are actually, that one?
The other down arrow.
The other down arrow. Got it. The sort of things that are actually required in a connected health system are these 3 areas. First of all, at the top of the triangle, we have acquisition. So we need to collect all of that data, and this is where we interface with the patient. So we need to have a variety of methodologies, techniques, technologies to interface with the patient to be able to record, store, transmit, monitor data from individuals and indeed from populations. The next action is that we need to analyse those. So out of a huge amount of data, we need to be able to pull the signals that we require to give us the capacity to make informed decisions in healthcare. So to be able to sort of analyse and present that information through a really user-friendly interface. The third area is where we interface with clinicians. So this is where all of the data is actually presented to be able to prevent, treat, monitor, diagnose. And so this is where the healthcare provider actually comes into the picture in sort of normal situations. However, the Institute, Tyree Eye Healthy, is absolutely focused in on the co-design process. So co-design is key. So what that means is you actually have to try to think about, rather than this sort of linear process where you pull in the different stakeholders at different times, is actually trying to get everybody on the same page from the beginning and co-designing the whole system with the collaboration of not only clinicians and scientists and technologists at the beginning, but also with consumer input, with patient input, and actually having those people around the table having input through the design process. So first of all, we need to actually engage with clinicians to define the unmet clinical need. Believe me, working in engineering and technology, it's really hard to get our young scientists past we've got this great widget, it's going to solve all these problems. The first question is really, where is the need? And I'm not talking about the engineering need, I'm talking about the clinical need. So it's that, defining the unmet needs, and then co-designing solutions with the right people with collaboration. We also bring into this an innovation process, which was designed through a group called CIMIT in Boston. This is a 20-year development, a very systematic process, which takes you through, and I'll mention a little bit more about this in a few slides' time, but it takes you through all the required steps with milestones to actually really try to make the process a lot more efficient and hopefully make a few less mistakes. The technology enablers that we need include all of these things here. I don't need to go through them. I think everybody knows about cloud computing and cloud data storage. I think most of us would have one of these. So it's having smartphones, mobile devices, also called mHealth. Having a lot of the capacity to actually analyze the data and do that in a really intelligent way. So using augmented intelligence, so machine learning, design support systems. Like Nigel mentioned some things on advanced visualization. So I think there's a whole lot of that sort of soft technology that comes into this as well. I've put sensors at the very end. I probably should have started with them, but I've put them at the end because sensors, in particularly looking at implantable sensors, is one of my areas. So I'm sort of being a little bit cheeky here. We're going to be talking mainly today about wearable sensors, but indeed connected health is actually about pretty much any device that, or it's centered around any device which is going to record data from a patient. And a lot of those are actually devices that also stimulate. So to indulge me just a little, this is my area of research, as Anne mentioned. So looking at neural interfaces, and basically what we develop in our research group is these soft, flexible, conductive coatings, which can create a much more tissue-like interface between a stimulating device and the tissue. And we've developed this patented technology, which supports the development of smaller, safer, high resolution electrodes, which are able to have higher charge injection limits for the stimulation side of things, much lower impedance. So we've trialed these on a variety of different implants. We've been working with Cochlear, looking at coating the cochlear electrode arrays. We've done some experimental cortical arrays, that's the image just at the bottom there. And also we've worked with Nigel's team, the Bionic Vision team, on the Bionic Eye and their hex arrays. So these are very simply coated onto the surface and are actually based on hydrogels, which is sort of counterintuitive, being sort of largely water containing, but they are very similar to tissue in terms of their mechanical properties. And this front page of a paper here is just showing a recent paper and one of our first badged Tyree Foundation papers looking at improving deep brain stimulators using these coatings. So that was just the advertisement break in the middle, and I'll get back to connected health now. So why do we care about connected health? What does it matter? It's got a huge range of benefits. And I think I mentioned earlier sort of patient-provider connectivity, but really it's got potential to actually connect not only patients and providers, it's actually got the potential to connect in, say, the life science companies, equipment manufacturers, so people who are providing equipment, insurers, etc. So there is potential for massive digital connectivity across the whole health service. Of course, facilitates self-managed care. I think we've probably all experienced some sort of telehealth over the COVID period, and certainly it has facilitated a lot of that self-managed care. Better access to care at lower cost, so outside traditional clinical settings, and finally assisting chronic care management and improving population health outcomes. And for those of you who are sort of in a budgety mood after last night, what's the market potential? So these are a couple of bits of data which I managed to grab from the internet, and they came out in 2016, so they're a bit old, but really looking at projected growth up to 2030 or 2024, I think the two is sort of between 20 and 27% compound annual growth rates. Bear in mind, this is sort of 2016, 2017. There's a few other things that have happened since then. One of them is COVID, and seriously, that has, I think, changed a lot about the consumer market and how acceptable using mobile technology and other technologies for connected health has become. So it has changed some things and most likely perturbed the growth and the growth rate of these sorts of systems. But I think more to the point, I'm talking the other points I've made are more around the global market. In terms of the Australian market, there is also this challenge that we have having these huge remote and regional communities. And it's very well known, all the data shows us that there is poorer healthcare access for rural and remote communities and very, very much poorer health outcomes. And I think connected health really gives us that potential to improve that connectivity with our non-metropolitan based people. So my final slide, not sure how I'm doing for time, but we'll live with that. So there are barriers to adoption, and that's one of the things that I mentioned earlier about these innovation processes. And really what a lot of the innovation processes are around are understanding the barriers to adoption and then how to mitigate them and how to address them. So, you know, you can see on that challenges list, regulatory, there's in health areas, there's always huge regulatory barriers, and you have to navigate your way through those. Reimbursement, who's going to pay for this? So that's often been a real problem with telehealth. Who is going to pay? Privacy, cybersecurity, obviously the big concern. And then we've already sort of touched on this consumer behaviour. So in Cardiovascular Eye Healthy, we're really looking at the CIMMET process. And up on this slide here, this shows the CIMMET process, which looks like a very linear sort of process wrapped around a circle. But in essence, it's got 4 interlinked dimensions. And these dimensions, you can see in the colours there, technology, regulatory, market and business, and last but certainly not least, clinical. And so for each of those dimensions, there are stage gates in your innovation process that you're guided through to ensure that you hit the milestones at the right time. And I think you can see the very, very first area that you look at is the need. And in this case, in healthcare, we're talking clinical need. So on that note, I think understanding clinical need, engaging with clinicians is absolutely essential for the development of really fantastic technologies which are going to help people. And I'm going to hand over to my clinical colleague who's going to tell you a little bit more about the work that we've been doing. Thank you.
See if I can find the right arrow. For that one? There you go. So the technology came very easily to the clinician. Thank you all so much for the invitation to speak today. A public hospital clinician doesn't often get to dine in his suit during the day. It's such a fine company and surroundings. So I thank you for the opportunity. I'll be bragging to all my colleagues when I get back to the hospital. It's been my pleasure over the last 5 or so years to work closely with Nigel and his team, and I'd like to thank him, the Eye Healthy crew, Robbie, Peter, and the Tyree Foundation for all their support to date. I'm a clinician, so I apologise for that. I'm just going to talk about clinical stuff, which is very close to home, and leave all the technological speak to Laura and Nigel. As Laura said, the thing that strikes me the most when I meet engineers is that particularly young engineering students often have no idea about what the clinical problem is or what we face from day to day. So I'd like to just walk through a little bit of context from a clinician's point of view before we delve into the sort of engineering side of things. This slide shows you the cardiovascular mortality over the last 70 odd years, and really it's an ode to engineering and pharma, because as you can see globally, the rates of cardiovascular mortality have declined quite significantly over 50 years. Basic sciences has given us a really good understanding of the underlying pathophysiology of cardiovascular disease. We've designed drugs, and engineering has given us the capability of putting people in bypass, cutting people's chest open, running their blood through a different machine without them being brain dead or dead, which is remarkable, replacing valves. coronary artery bypass grafting, stents, 3 generations of stents, bioabsorbable stents, drug-eluting stents, which have all made iterative improvements to the outcomes for our patients, pacemakers, defibrillators, etc. You all know that technology, and this is the outcome, that there's been a steady decline over the last 50 years in terms of mortality rates age-adjusted across the board. And yet, despite that, it remains the #1 cause of death in developed countries. And there's some recent epidemiological evidence, I'm not sure it translates all that well in this slide, but it would suggest that in developed countries that rate of decline has plateaued, and in certain demographics is now rising. And despite all of those improvements, hospitalizations continue to rise. And that's driven by a lot of factors, population growth, an older population. The slide on the graph on the left-hand side shows you a projection of the number of over 85-year-olds that South East Sydney LHD will be servicing up until the next 10 years. You can see there's an exponential rise projected, and also driven by rising levels of obesity. And there's again a graph from the Heart Foundation showing you that obesity rates in our community continue to rise, and particularly in children. And there are many epidemiologists who would predict the tsunami of cardiovascular disease on the horizon is really driven by unprecedented rates of childhood obesity. On the ground, that's a problem. Every day, our junior staff are instructed to see patients with the primary objective of finding people who you can discharge, because there's an emergency room full of people who need to fill those beds so that they can fill the emergency department again. We know that if we don't change the way that we deliver health, over the next 5 years, we'll be looking at 50% more emergency presentations. We'll need double the number of hospital beds. We are a hospital system beyond capacity, and things need to change. And so the question I guess we've been posing is, can connected health, doing things differently, using technologies to change our model of care? Believe it or not, slightly reticent to saying this, worried that an engineer might pounce up and slap me when I say this, but we still use fax machines in hospitals. We've got a long way to go. And I guess the question we've asked is, can we use some of these technologies that I use in day-to-day life? I mean, I use my mobile phone more than any other appliance. Could we harness some of these capabilities to improve the way that we deliver care and try and address some of these problems that we're facing in the health system? The idea is not new. You can tell by the age of the learned gentlemen on this slide, one of which is Nigel and the other Branko Seller, who I'm sure you all know really well, that the idea of remote monitoring in telehealth has been around a long time. They took this standalone system that's sitting on a bench in front of Branko, took it to commercialization and showed in the NBN demonstrator trial that it improves health outcomes and is fiscally viable, but probably was a little bit too early for their time. Definitely difficult to carry that machine around in your pocket. And so what we've done is we've translated that know-how and that technology. I've written their tailcoats, and we developed together, co-designed a smartphone-based model of care for our cardiac patients, which we initially called total cardiac care, but because it's now spanned to lots of disease cohorts, it's called Tele-Clinical Care now. I'll whiz through this because you all understand the technology. It's a smartphone. It pairs to various sensors. For the original pilot study, we used blood pressure cuff, Blake scale, and an activity monitor that was wearable. It displays all that information back to the patient, which is really important, and I'll come back to why that's important, so that they could track their own progress. And it delivered messages 3 times a week. There's an example on the right-hand side to promote healthy behaviour choices. So we work closely with the Heart Foundation, to Robin Gallagher from School of Nursing USyd, to design these messages that are delivered. And there's a lot of trial work that's been done before, notably by Clara Chow, one of the local Sydney cardiologists and president of CSAMS, who did a lot of work in terms of text messages and how that can help promote healthy behaviour change. That's the patient end. On the back end, all that data comes to a back end clinician dashboard, which we can monitor. And we've used that to design an alert management system that's based on this system called Between the Flags. And for those who aren't clinicians, I might just pause for a second and explain. So in the hospital, we have a system that's based on electronic medical record where you can set defaults for alerts and they get automatically generated. And the idea is to identify the deteriorating patient before they arrest, because by the time they arrest and you get there, it's usually too late. So that's called the Between the Flags concept. It was pioneered by Ken Hillman at Liverpool Hospital. And so we designed a system just based on that you were able to, we have some default settings for yellow alerts, red alerts, and they're customizable, obviously, so they can suit any sort of patient or clinician or context. And we ran a pilot study of this. We were hoping to get 300 patients, but this thing called COVID happened, and so we had to stop recruitment amongst the hospitals. So we recruited 164 patients across 2 sites, but mainly Prince Wales Hospital. They're all cardiac patients who'd been admitted, and at the time of discharge, they were enrolled in the use of the app. Most of them were acute coronary syndrome patients, so people who had either a heart attack or angina, and about 22% were heart failure patients. And this is what we found. So our primary endpoint was 30-day readmission rates, and that was unchanged. But you can see beyond the 30-day mark that the curves diverge and continue to diverge at 6 months. And what we showed was a statistically significant reduction, approximate halving in the number of readmissions in those who were enrolled in the intervention. So it seemed to work, at least across 2 sites. We also saw some really interesting things that we didn't target or weren't specifically addressing through the model of care. Firstly, we saw that attendance to and completion of face-to-face traditional cardiac rehabilitation was greater in the intervention arm. So just to briefly explain, cardiac rehabilitation is a program that patients after discharge, usually after a coronary event, go through. They get an exercise program, education, psychological support, evidence-based, guideline-driven, and really poorly attended. So the global cardiac rehabilitation attendance rates are somewhere in the order of 30% for a variety of reasons. And what we were able to demonstrate is that we could improve cardiac rehabilitation completion rates. And the other interesting thing we saw was that medication adherence was improved in the intervention arm as opposed to the control arm. And what we supposed on the basis of those 2 observations was that the app, or receiving and being able to look at your own data, receiving the notifications, engage patients in self-care. And we also ran a primitive cost-effective analysis to show that it was fiscally viable after you recruit 200 odd patients. I would say that we've made lots of iterative improvements to the back end and to the model of care around it. So I think actually the next analysis will be even more promising. And on the basis of that pilot work, we were given a $1.9 million grant from New South Wales Health to run a large multi-site randomised controlled trial across New South Wales, which is currently underway. And hopefully I'll be invited back one day to share those results with you. We segued a little bit in 2020 in the pandemic after a corridor conversation with a colleague about their difficulties monitoring patients in the community. You may or may not recall, because it's a while ago now, but right at the beginning in New York and Lombardy, there were large numbers of patients, of people with COVID in the community who were isolated. They were at home. There was no way they could actually receive any medical care or get any reassurance or get any advice. And there was much in-community death. And our concern right at the beginning of the pandemic, you'll recall that the steep rise in numbers here in Sydney mirrored New York, mirrored Lombardy, and Southeast Sydney was actually the epicenter. Actually turned out to be very young backpackers who did get all that sick, but we didn't know at the time. And so after that corridor conversation, Nigel's team segued to build an app that could be delivered to remotely monitor patients in the community with COVID infection, with the idea of being able to deteriorate the clinically deteriorating patient. Because the other interesting thing about COVID is that you get symptoms very late. And usually by the time you have symptoms and you're sick and you end up in emergency, you need to be intubated. And monitoring oxygen saturation seems to detect deterioration earlier than symptoms. but also was a way that we could message patients and provide some reassurance that they were actually being monitored and supported in home, even though they weren't being directly contacted. And so we actually had a 6-week sprint. It was very busy. Everyone cancelled their Easter holidays. We worked virtually as a team, and very proud of what we managed to achieve in that period of time. And we implemented this firstly as a clinical trial, but then it became a clinical implementation across the LHD, and up to now we've monitored approximately 4,000 patients across the LHD. And hopefully we'll publish those results shortly. We've also segued to other disease cohorts, as I mentioned. Stroke's an easy one because it's cardiovascular disease as well, and we've got an MRFFF grant and a stroke trial underway that's led by Ken Butcher, one of our mates at UNSW and Prince of Wales Hospital. And I would say that what the pandemic has given us is a very obvious change in the acceptability amongst patients and amongst clinicians for the whole concept of remote monitoring and using digital health for your patients. And so there isn't a week that doesn't go by where we're approached by yet another set of physicians or surgeons with some idea about remote monitoring. And so we now have a full suite of work for other disease cohorts, using different sensors, using different models of care, using variations of the app and the back end, but being able to deliver a connection between patients, physicians, GPs, to deliver a better model of care that hopefully is sustainable and reduces hospitalisation. I might stop there. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to sort of wrap this up. I'm short of time, so I might whiz through these slides and allow as much time for questions as possible. But as you can observe from Deanna and Laura, connected health truly has had a huge impact, not just throughout sort of our LHD, local health district, and in southeast Sydney, but now, obviously, it's had impacts throughout New South Wales and Australia with some of the technologies we've been developing. And as Laura mentioned, the core to this is to have co-designed solutions. Going back to Thyri Eye Healthy, I said that we focus on one pillar of connected health, and that's what we've done over the last year. We've been, I think, fairly successful in terms of raising about $10 million worth of grant funds, and probably about another $5 million in industry funds going forward over the next 5 years. But there's connectivity and work to be done in terms of health technologies in a number of other areas. So we're looking at creating these translational research pillars in imaging analytics, translational biomechanics, and in bionics and biorobotics. In each of those areas, there is still this need for connectivity, and Laura actually highlighted it when she was talking about her research area, and particularly in the bionics and biorobotics area, there's this great need for interfacing or connectivity. What I want to do was sort of have a bit of a discussion about that and then try to bring it all together in the last slide or two. So in terms of connections of technology to biology, and in terms of neural interfaces, the obvious I guess example is the cochlea. So about 30 years ago, or even longer, the first cochlear device was developed with 22 metal platinum electrodes, and that was inserted in the cochlea, and that had to interface to 30,000 ganglion cells in the cochlea. And obviously nature decided on 30,000 because it wanted to have that level of sort of pitch differentiation. So advance 30 years to the latest cochlear device, and you'd think it would have many more electrodes, but no, it hasn't. It's still got 22 metal electrodes. And we still have this great challenge of trying to connect technology into biology, into the nervous system. So here's an example from a Nature paper from a few years ago for closing the loop for using motor sort of thoughts to electrically stimulate the arm to produce motor movements. And it's using this bed of nails UTAR array, and that's the state of the art. And here's a clinical example. This is an ECOG array. So it's an array that's placed over the cortex, over the dura, to record cortical activity to try to identify the focus of epileptic seizures. And this is an example from what's been done now in clinical practice. So we really have this need for improving the interface. And my particular interest in this is in sort of a neural prosthesis or a bionic eye. Some of you may know that. And a similar thing about interfaces there. This is the first cortical visual prosthesis from Brindley about 50 years ago. So this patient had electrodes buried in their heads, and they were stimulated remotely, and the person would see these spots of light. So we've been working on a new generation of that using a device that goes into the eye, into the interfaces with the retina, and the device on the left is our current generation technology, but it only has about 100 electrodes. I'm just skipping through this quickly. If you sort of look at the number of functional electrodes versus the improvement in quality of life, you get a sort of a representation like this, where the second block on the left is really the technology of today. It's about tens of electrodes, and that's similar to the cochlea where they have 20 electrodes. With our Bionic Eye technology today, we've got about 100 electrodes, and that allows us to do sort of unaided navigation. What we need to do is come up with ways of better connecting technology into the nervous system. And Laura presented one example of that with the sort of new materials and coatings approach. We've got running in this new bionic pillar a number of other approaches around optical techniques. And I just wanted to touch very briefly on a molecular biological approach that we're working on. So harking back to the cochlea, here's an example of a case where we're using molecular biology and medical device technology together, a combined therapy. And this is the way of the future in terms of connectivity. What we've got here is what is on the left, you can see the introduction of a cochlear electrode array into a cochlea. And before we actually put the final implant in the cochlear device, we actually put in some plasmid DNA, so naked DNA. And we have to then somehow get that DNA into the cochlear cells. And to do that, we've come up with a technique called Electro Transfer, where we give a high voltage electrical pulse, and that drives this DNA into the mesenchymal cells of the cochlea. And this DNA is coded to have to create neurite extension in those cells. So it's coded to make the cells regrow their neurites. And that's what you see on the top right image there in a treated cochlea. You can see these neurites that are now growing towards where the metal electrode would be in the cochlea compared with the control case. And we can see in chronic animal experiments the vast improvement of this technology. On the far right, we have a control case where really it's either on or off. But in this case where we have the neurites being regrown, we've got this graded response. And we've demonstrated that in animals, and I can't say too much because it's we're running a clinical trial. We're halfway through it, delayed due to cochlea, but we're getting similar results in human patients. So expanding on that in terms of how these implantable devices sort of come back to a more traditional view of connected health, and Laura made a reference to it as well. All these implantable devices these days, or the majority of them, have the capacity to incorporate reverse telemetry. So you've got a device that can monitor the status of the person. Now, usually it's with relation to the specific device, but more and more they're putting other sensors in these devices. Neurostimulation devices for DBS have accelerometers in them now, so we can tell if a person's fallen, for example. So the whole idea is to sort of converge all these areas together. And this is, I guess, my last slide, because if you think of the bigger view of connected health, what we're looking at now is remote monitoring data, not just from wearables, but also from implantable devices, also from unintrusive devices. We have trials where we don't put monitors on the person, but we monitor the environment using infrared cameras and millimeter wave radar. So from that, we can detect people who are more likely to fall, for example. And we want to fuse all this data with the electronic medical record, which we have those projects in place already, fusing with many of the medical record systems in New South Wales Health, with primary care data to come up with this comprehensive longitudinal medical record. And that allows us then to predict whether a person is likely to exacerbate or deteriorate and intervene appropriately. It allows us to apply predictive analytics models to look at trends in these longitudinal measurements to do that. But it also provides this sort of holistic model, this model of continuity of care from the hospital to community, to GP world, to home, and also promoting self-care. And as Sian also mentioned, with one of the silver linings with COVID has been, I think, this realization that connected health is the way of the future, and we have to come up with not just sort of tweaking existing models of care, but coming up with new models of care, new business models to support this way of life, because it is the way of the future. And on that, I'll stop. Thank you.
I'll get the microphone to her and she'll ask the questions in the room. Peter, I think
Well, look, that was fascinating. That's an alumni of the University of New South Wales who has wonderful talks, and to hear that the Atari Foundation is getting into bio, which is good. But the question is, how much are you limited by the readouts that you can get? Because basically, you're talking about critical readout, beating rates, oxygen levels, these things. How much further would you get if you get starting to get biological readout of what's going on in the body?
Yeah, so Peter Gray was asking how much further can we go with differing sort of more advanced readouts. Maybe it's a clinical question that Sian might want to. That's called a hospital pass.
Thanks for that, Nigel. This is usually how the collaboration works. The answer is I don't know. I mean, I'm excited about the possibility, and certainly, you can see the sensors that we are using currently are very crude, but we're already exploring sensors that will provide us with, continuous data, data from implanted devices. So I implant pacemakers and defibrillators, and I'm sure you already know that there's a lot of data that comes from them in a continuous fashion. So being able to leverage that kind of sensor, to be able to sense things at a cellular level would be amazing. And then to be able to use sort of, machine learning and those sorts of capabilities applied to that data to make sense of it. The mind boggles in terms of possibilities. Can't possibly answer that question because we haven't done it, but keen to.
Are you going to mention Saluda?
No, I was going to mention something else. I skipped over because we're running short of time. One slide that I was going to put up, and that was around sort of the future of medicine based around computational modelling. So modelling across scales. So we're quite good at building A380s using computational models now. We're not really good at understanding the biology across large temporal and spatial scales. We can span one or two scales, but this will be the way of the future, in that we'll be able to have models, that have the constitutive properties of the human body at that level, so that we can map from the genome to sort of metabolic pathways to, ionic pathways, cell membranes, organs, and even the exposomes, our external factors. And once we've got those models that span those scales, that's when we can truly have, we change the face of medicine.
And I just wanted to give another example. I'm sure most of you are familiar with John Parker at Saluda. And if you're talking about biological signals and detecting sort of very small cellular level biological signals, their device is a spinal implant. So it's a stimulator that goes next to the spinal cord. And it's able to detect action potentials, which are the sort of basically showing that the nerve cell has been activated. That's at the cellular level. And what that enables is perhaps not a connected health example, but it certainly is a closed loop example, which is allowing the device to actually perform much better because it's closing this loop. It's able to identify through the software, it's able to sort of detect if they're not able to detect the action potential, and then it's able to modulate the stimulation and the recording according to what it's detecting. So I think you can actually go down right to the cellular level, and ultimately that sort of data that they're capturing that. They're perhaps not putting it through a user interface, but they're capturing all of that data. So it's a massive amount of really incredible data.
Thank you. We had a question here.
Yeah, I've got a question, probably also for Laura. Regulatory frameworks are really important as we see the momentum accelerating around medtech and medical devices and all the great things you talked about. Do you see an opportunity for reform or to change the timings of those approval cycles? Because we're seeing a lot of very innovative companies trying to come into the market with great technology and form the right partnerships, but then you go through this whole process that was being built for, the late 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. So just curious to get your...
Repeat the question.
So the question there was around the regulatory cycles and the exhaustive length of those cycles. Look, I worked for 10 years with the Expert Advisory Committee, which was working with therapeutic goods, looking at whether to place certain difficult devices onto the register. So these were devices probably at the end of a very, very, very long process. When you're talking connected health processes, and in particular COVID, I think the TGA has been a lot more agile. And they have actually responded to the situation. And I think perhaps one of my colleagues might want to say something more about that.
Yeah, so I did briefly mention our COVID app, which was originally run under the guise of a clinical trial, simply for the purposes of avoiding regulatory. Actually, we were able to get TGA exemptions through and therefore run it as a pure implementation. So there did seem to be some flexibility from TGA, which I didn't think was actually possible. So maybe things are changing.
A question for Professor Phelps.
Would you like me to yell?
Oh, no, we'll repeat it.
Okay. Fascinating presentation, if I might compliment you all on what you've been doing. But Australia's quite good at nanotechnology, and it's possible to build nanosensors that are wearable to measure most things, medical things or indeed biological things, the sort Peter talked about. Could you tell us what are the top six that you'd like to monitor to A, reduce the cost of medicine in Australia, and secondly, prolong the life of people with the quality of life? It would be very helpful. I mean, we could do that as a national program. We can do it if we know what you want.
Professor Fell asked the curly one about nanotechnology and how we could use that for sensing. Look, we actually do work in Characterize Eye Healthy and in the Graduate School of Biomedical Engineering in sort of aspects of nanomedicine. We've got a recent project with Merck Sharp and Dohme to actually combine biosensing in the gut for looking at sort of gut disease.
Top six.
Top 6. Okay.
I think we should pass it back.
I might pass, but because the problem with all these nano sensors is how to connect to them, how to interface.
We can do that, quite straightforward.
That's the thing that kills us.
Chris, can you, I'm actually going to hospital pass it too, but can you actually detect these in very, very noisy environments with a lot of proteins or a lot of other things? Because sensing is fantastic and it works brilliantly in vitro. And I think that getting across that step of actually overcoming the fouling is something that's really, really challenging when you put it into the body. Yeah, it's you know, that's sort of the technical challenge. The clinical challenge, I would say that you know, from us as engineers and technologists, we basically want to talk to the clinicians and say, where is the need? And we actually have to validate that need. And we have to then find, is there a business model for this?
Look, I agree, but look, talk to the astronomers about how they found exoplanets in a very noisy environment. It's exactly the same problem that you're facing. It is indivisible.
Chris, I'm going to have to, I don't want to say close it down, but you're asking very valid things, and I don't think we have answers, but I'm going to step in and say, I think that Nigel, Laura and Sian have noted your need for focusing on those with the highest cost benefits in the ultimate journey. Mark, I think, was it, or someone over this table?
Okay. Keep it short. Grant Stephen. As a beneficiary on Sian's curve from the mid-80s, early 80s, of most of the cardiac developments, I've got implanted devices, I've had them all. Okay? So I'm a great beneficiary, but I live in Sydney, and I was horrified to find it might be a regulatory thing. That if I'm south of Wollongong and have a stroke or a heart attack, with no registrar, neurosurgical or cardiac registry, to sign off for the advanced treatments, thrombolyzed, what's the other one you get? Thrombolyzed, I had it all. And another one, a really advanced procedure that does take a really clever registrar to make the decision. So my problem is to keep more of these people, because I don't travel south of Wollongong, because I know there's nobody there. So, you like the comment, or it's outside your framework? Someone did mention.
Slightly outside my framework, but I'd love. Oh, sorry. So the question is, there's a great need, isn't there, outside of metropolitan Sydney, but it's an Australia-wide problem, isn't it? That rural, regional Australia really does suffer from lack of resources. I wish my mate Ken Butcher was here, because not only is he part of TCC Stroke, but he's also the New South Wales Director of Telestroke, which is a service of metropolitan-based neurologists who support physicians in rural regional Australia, providing their ability to look at scans at short notice and to be able to deliver advice and recommendations with regards to the care of Australians in regional Australia. So I guess that's one example of using the technological know-how that we have, but applying it so that we can have some equity between rural, regional Australia and metropolitan Australia. And with regards to our project, I really think, you know, we showed some benefit in metropolitan Sydney, but I'm sure that the benefit, and we're testing this now because we've got multiple regional sites, will be exponential in those areas.
Thank you. I thought there was a hand just up here. Con? No? Are there any other questions from around the Amy?
I was involved in a project at ATSE where we were working with a plumbing company which has got digitally connected plumbing. So if you've got somebody who's living at home and they don't turn on their bathroom tap at a certain time or between an expected window, it sends a signal to say maybe that person's not right. So there's kind of a lived environment part of this puzzle, which might ultimately join up. Are you aware of initiatives like that that kind of give alternative signals of health status that could plug into these types of programs?
Yeah, we have, so the question was sort of alternate monitoring sort of approaches that may be more ubiquitous or even slightly different, so it might be environmental type monitoring and the like. Yeah, Branko Sella and I, back in the early 90s, with British Telecom, ran a sort of unobtrusive monitoring trial where we looked at, you know, sensing the environment, so looking at some power draws for, you know, where people were using utilities, their mobility throughout the house, through sort of passive infrared sensing, and using, back then, very crude models to infer health status. So that was part of my my point, I think, in when I was talking about fusing data. So I can see that we can get physiological measurement data quite easily, but this unobtrusive, sort of more pervasive data could be merged into these records for the sort of the predictive analytic approaches. So it's very relevant. And I see there's 20-something chats online. So this is a problem with a hybrid talk as well. There's probably people asking questions online. You okay?
I have a question. So you talked about a smartphone app, which sounds great. Firstly, there are several different platforms. Is it compatible across all platforms? And the second part of that is, what about security?
Okay, so that's a really good question, and that's why we are different. Oh, sorry, the question is around sort of smartphone apps and issues with security and cross-platform support. So there are literally 10,000 apps out there for health and lifestyle. But what we have done right from the start is we have engaged in the co-design process. We've worked with New South Wales Health's human-centered design team. We've worked with eHealth. We have, when we went to an implementation, we took our systems and we did penetration testing, and we got South East Sydney's ICT to sort of check the systems for security, and also similarly, seeing we had a regulatory background and understood those sort of, you know, documentation and compliance, we built these systems with that in mind and with cross-platform support, so it works with iOS and Android and the like.
Thank you. Follow up from Julian Epps and then from Michael.
Well, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but fascinating to see the cardiovascular graph that you offered at the beginning and the uptick then in the need. Another area that has increasing need, I think, is mental health. I'm just curious what's happening in that space and where you see the biggest developments in the coming years.
Yeah, thank you. So the question was about whether or not we have been working with mental health, which is, yeah, you're right, an enormous need. So the answer is yes, in multiple ways. So I think actually that our data would show that the most important outcome for monitoring COVID patients during the pandemic was not actually the detection of the deteriorating patient and avoiding, you know, hospitalisation, intensive care, etc., but was actually the support that they received from an emotional point of view. I can't underplay that actually. It's very difficult to, when you talk about a technology, to explain to you all just how difficult it was to implement this, because the population we were dealing with was like a population we'd never seen before, unbelievable levels of anxiety to the point where it was really difficult to engage. And so, yes, that's really important. So, but specifically with regards to working with the mental health team, we've been working closely and working on some stuff with the mental health team in our LHD, but also Mind Gardens. And there are two aspects to it, aren't there? So anyone with chronic disease, there are mental health overlays, right? And so part of the capabilities that we're trying to build into every module has to do with using tools that are already developed. So Black Dog Institute is you know, has a lot of expertise in this area, using tools to identify anxiety and depression in patients with chronic disease, and then referring them to the appropriate people who manage that, because I can tell you cardiologists aren't very good at managing that. But also secondly, is the corollary, which is that the #1 cause of death in those with severe mental health disease, so schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, is actually cardiovascular disease. So you know, it's a two-way street. So absolutely, it's an avenue we're exploring. Thanks for the question.
We have a question just here.
Right. One of the, it's slightly not on the topic, but one of the key things the medical profession faces diagnostics. And the number of times they get it wrong, I mean, no fault. Now the medical systems are washed with data, and also we know from social studies and other areas, basically now system cluster analysis, etc., etc. So the mechanisms for actually having massive amounts of data to try and sort out causality and other things is right to help the diagnostics. And I know there have been a few minor little attempts at it, but I'm just curious about that stage because it's actually very important. Save a lot of money if you don't go down the wrong path.
So let me see if I understood the question correctly, but we do live in an age where we have a lot of data. And the question is how to make sense of all the data that we have to improve our ability to characterize diseases and make diagnoses. Is that correct?
And it has been done in social settings about other aspects, so it can be done.
Look, it's a great question, and I would actually say that probably we don't utilise all the data well at all because the medical system sits in silos. So part of the connected bit isn't actually connection with patients, but just one physician connecting with another physician. In particular, primary health, we connect very poorly with for a variety of reasons, a lot of which are actually technology is, as much as, physician's choice. And we are trying to address that. So we're doing a lot of work just trying to harness and utilise the data that sits in EHRs. Electronic health records. So, all the hospital systems are electronic right now, but they don't talk to the system I have in my rooms, and we don't make much sense of it because a lot of the data is actually unstructured, or a lot of data sits in other formats like images. And so one of the things that we're doing is pulling together all the data from the unstructured data, the structured data, images, etc., and using the capabilities in engineering to try and make some sense of the noise and give clinicians, because clinicians don't understand it or don't have time, definitely don't have time, give clinicians some way of visualizing that data in a way that helps them and their patients. So it's an enormous issue, I agree.
I was just going to add something. Sorry. I'm actually going to sort of not answer your question. I'm going to segue a little bit, just because it is pertinent to your question, and that's education. I think it's been mentioned that there's these silos. One of the things that we're doing at Characterize is looking at how can we better educate our engineers and our clinicians to sort of come together. And so engineering has what's called the Challenge program at UNSW, and we've got all these what are called vertically integrated or VIP projects. And in some of those, what we're doing is we're actually bringing together students from medicine, studying medicine and engineering together in one team, and CU's engaged in that as well. And I think that, if we're educating the next generation to perhaps connect more, then it may address this issue.
Well, Peter just reminded me to talk about artificial intelligence and sort of.
I did.
And that's basically an extension of what CM was talking about. We're applying our predictive analytics to and the siloing of this data is and finding appropriate ground truths. So that means clinicians have to annotate those data often. Getting the large data sets that deep learning models require is probably one of our biggest barriers.
Okay. Would you like to? We've got to.
So thank you to our speakers, and I'd like to ask Peter to give the vote of thanks and remind you that Peter is chairman of the TARI Foundation, and they've had a most long and distinguished record in the areas of education, community support and medical science. So Peter.
Thank you, Aaron. I might pick you up on one comment just then. My gorgeous sister Robbie, who is sitting just over here, is now the chairman of the TARI Foundation. So I was, but I've now handed to a more beautiful hand than what I've got. Well done, Anne and Addie, first of all, for saving the day on the communications, and we're finishing on time, nevertheless. My usual role here is to move a vote of thanks, but on a day like today, it takes on a special importance. Not only are we talking about technology, and we're seeing an evolution, and I'm going to go almost to the end of the talks today, where Nigel was talking a little bit about Franco Sella, and we're also talking earlier about the cochlear implants. So Robbie and I have had a wonderful leadership, if you like, in the Tyree Foundation, set by our dear father, who was also, curiously, also a member of ATSE. I'm not aware, but I think we're the only father-son team who are fellows of ATSE so far. I hope one day that might change and there's another one. But we've seen technology with the cochlear implant evolve. A lot of people would not know that we should be thanking two Bills, Bill Tyree, my father, and Professor Bill Gibson at the University of Sydney, who was developing a part of the cochlear implants along with the Melbourne-based institute. And then, in turn, Professor Roberts, who was affiliated with the University of New South Wales, was the chief executive of Cochlear for a number of years and still remains with a connection into UNSW. And with he and then Bronwyn Evans, who's now the chief executive of Engineers Australia, playing a massive role in Cochlear, have shown us the answer to one of the questions which came up. Where do we go? What are our boundaries? So I don't think anyone in this room knows where this technology is bounded. I don't think there are boundaries. Commercial boundaries are going to be exceeded. It's a massive industry for the future. The technology boundaries, like Cochlear, are now having an application, albeit with 3 times the number of inputs or drivers behind it. But it's using some of those same technologies to pick up on the signals. And Neuro, which is another part of the university, connected also, as is the Tyree Eye Healthy Institute, connected with Prince of Wales Hospital. We don't know the boundaries in any respect. And of course, commercially, I could bring to the table here, Lepus, one of the questions asked today because I can't say Dimopoulos, I'll say Bill or the people from this table here, Dimo, we refer to him in short. Lepus is developing wearable technologies which have got an approval for some trials out of the NHS in the UK. So the boundaries aren't known. It's an industry that's going to develop and deploy. Now, I'm sort of a little bit off the track, but I'm saying it's special because I'd like to say on behalf of my sister and I and the Tyree Foundation, we're just delighted to see the team of people that are working on this whole project, and thank you. I've got two sort of votes to thank. One is the personal thing to the people involved in Tyree Eye Healthy, and secondly, for the talk that you've given today. I think that we've also seen one other thing that is dear to ATSE's heart is the immense role for STEM in this, and science, technology, engineering and maths. You can't do this without that. And dare I also say that at the risk of sort of being accused of some sexism. I can't imagine people more equipped to do this than the young women coming through high school today that will be promoted to do STEM subjects and have such an involvement. And why I sort of bring the sexist part in is that engineering is now not dirty. It's not about just mining or railways and factories with boiler makers and things. It is such an attractive industry for anyone to get into. I was talking about my father earlier. I was made or pushed, but I loved it, going into his factories when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. I think I'm deaf in this ear because in those days there was no ear protection whatsoever. Dare I say, because he also lost a bit of hearing, which I think was industrial veterans, that's a part of what led him into wanting to help generate the technology in the cochlear implants. It's certainly another reason as you go through life that the Tyree Foundation wants to help medical science and also, of course, the electrical industry with grids. But really being optimistic about it, what a huge market, what a great benefit to mankind. I think that it's important to note that Aaron spoke and took us through what the problems are. And he told us that improvements in health over the years certainly have been made, but I was surprised to hear that hospitalisations continue to rise and are a function we would have all thought of age, and people are living longer. But who would have thought, I didn't, that obesity was a driver of health problems that needs a solution. We must change the way we manage health was the key part of what I thought Cian spoke about. We've got to change the way we manage, or we're going to run out of beds. We're going to run out of ambulances going from one place to another. We're going to have this aged population that need care in the home or the aged care facilities, because you won't get them to the bed in the hospital, and maybe it's a lot healthier, particularly we've learned through COVID. So I'm saying COVID actually is an accidental friend that has made us realise that at-home monitoring or in aged care facilities monitoring or farmers, we talked a bit about, there was a question about regional from over here. The gentleman's gone, eh? But there's a question about regional input. This sort of monitoring at home is a panacea, I'm saying, for all ills. For that, I mentioned Branko Sella, and it's a pity that he's not here. I would particularly, although he's not here, Laura or Nigel, please mention that he's in Rob's and my heart as a helper, because he's been on this Tyree journey for many, many years. And if you could pass on those thanks and tell him he looked a lot more handsome in the photo that was up there with Nigel. I'd have to say that Nigel gave a wonderful summary, thank you Nigel, that brought home where the future will go, but we cannot, in my opinion, guess where those boundaries are, and I've already spoken a little bit about that. It's a very strong opinion of mine. We just don't know where those boundaries are, but we do know it's important for us as a society. It's a global issue, and it's also a way that there is dignity in growing old, because we'll be monitoring real life situations that maybe a person with dementia can't enunciate themselves. Maybe a person who's deaf or dumb can't say what ails them. So there's a lot of benefits that come out of knowing real facts from real equipment that's sensing what's happening. So on your behalf, everyone here, everyone that's online, and of course the Tyree Foundation. I'd like to thank you, Nigel, Laura and Sian, for your wonderful set of presentations. I particularly say Robbie and I are proud of you and your work. Would you all join me in normal acclamation?
Thank you, Peter, for really good work. So that brings our event to a close. Thank you to Peter. Thank you to our eminent speakers. Thank you to the organisation, sort of, and the technical aid and the ATSE people online. We got there. I was worried when it was 20 past and we still hadn't got anything up on the screen. Thank you all for coming very much. I hope you found it stimulating, interesting. That is the way of the future. For the people online, thank you also. So I wish you all a very good afternoon.